In today's video, I want to show you a strategy that I am currently using myself to grow my cryptocurrencies, and all of this as conservatively as possible, meaning without taking on much risk. Some time ago, I already posted a video about this on my YouTube channel where I explained this strategy in detail. In the meantime, I have 4 Ethereum grid trading bots running, which have already generated up to 10% profit in Ethereum for me in some cases. That means I put in 1 Ethereum, and now I already have 10% more Ethereum. But these are not guaranteed profits, at least not yet. I'll get to that later. For those who don't know what grid trading bots are, I'll briefly explain that later as well, but how does this strategy actually work? Instead of putting US Tether into a grid trading bot, I use the cryptocurrency itself, for example Bitcoin or Ethereum. These are put into this grid trading bot, which is a futures grid trading bot. What you end up with in the end is simply more Bitcoins or more Ethereums, or more of whatever cryptocurrency you use in it. It should also be said in advance that currently you can only do this on the Pionex exchange. I'm not aware of any other exchange that offers a grid trading bot with coin margin, where I can actually put in the cryptocurrency itself. If you're not on Pionex yet, feel free to check out the link in the video description. There you can get up to $1,000 as a bonus for a grid trading bot, depending on your deposit. Or if you just complete KYC too, you'll get 50 US Tether as an additional grid trading bonus on top. For those who don't know how a grid trading bot works, here's a very brief explanation. I'll use one of my current bots as an example, which I have opened with US Tether. Let's take this Ethereum futures grid here, for example, and take a closer look at it. Basically, nothing else happens except that we have a starting price where we say, this is where I want to open a long position, and then above and below us, the grid trading bot. We'll also set one up later so I can show you how I plan my new bot. But what happens then? That my investment is placed below here with long orders, but above the opening price, there are already take profit prices. But what happens if we now say we drop down here, as was the case in this example? For example, it picked up this grid here, the first grid, and if the price rises again, it sells this portion up here again. The same thing happens if it continues to go down. It opens another long position here, and this small long position would be closed here again. And to the upside, it just keeps selling again and again. And if the price now rises sharply, it closes all open long positions. And if it only drops a little bit again, it opens a new long position here and would sell it at the next higher level. This means that the lines above and below are always connected to each other, opening a long trade and closing it above. That's just a brief explanation. We'll take a look at this again during the setup. But now I want to show you the results I currently have because I have started 4 grid trading bots since my video where I introduced the strategy, and these are the current results. You can see here that as of now, in 29 days, it has generated 10% more Ethereum if I were to close it now. We need to distinguish between grid profit and trend P&L. Because the grid profit is already the guaranteed profit that I have on the side due to the individual grids that I just showed you, which are being traded. But the trend P&L, as is the case here, means nothing other than that I had a strong upward movement and that nothing else happened, except that on the way up, an incredible number of long positions were closed and will only be reopened when the price triggers the lower lines again. And that's why the trend P&L is now a provisional profit and not a guaranteed profit. But here, in 29 days, I have almost 2% guaranteed Ethereum profit in it. The trend P&L here is at 8.22. Overall, that's 10% more Ethereum than if I had just left it sitting in my wallet. You can see here my starting price was $1,826 in this example, in this case. And my liquidation price here is $983. That's why I said at the beginning that I'm doing this very, very conservatively, and I also want to show what advantage this actually brings. Even if the price should move in this direction now, I still have the opportunity to buy Ethereum at an incredibly low price before I get liquidated and then add it to the bot as extra margin. I can actually do that right here. As a small example in advance, if I add 1 Ethereum here, my liquidation price drops to $768 in this case. And that's how I could proceed. But we'll get to that later. The second bot has now generated 3.07% here. Of that, 7.42% is already guaranteed profit. But my trend P&L is at a loss here at 4.33%. But overall, this means that because I've already set aside so much grid profit during these 52 days that this bot has been running, the bot is still in profit, even though the starting price was worse than the current price. Actually, it's more than $200 lower so far. So despite everything, I'm in profit. And that's of course really, really awesome. At the current moment, it tells me I would make about 51% per year. Another big advantage, which I want to explain to you, the more grid profits are set aside here, the more the liquidation price drops. Accordingly, I also have the possibility here that the longer the bot runs, the better my liquidation price becomes. If we take a look at the next bot, it's been running for 47 days. That was actually my third bot. It has currently generated 6.53% profit in Ethereum, so just under 0.1 Ethereum. If we look at my investment, these are all 2 times leverage bots, except for the first one, except for the one up there, because I got a good entry price on that one, so I went in with higher leverage. But the third bot has a liquidation price of $960. The guaranteed grid profit, which I already have, is 3.45%, and the trend P&L is 3.06%. Overall, that comes to 6.52%. But what's important to me is that I want to let it run for a long time over a wide range, because I probably won't sell this Ethereum before it reaches 4,000 US dollars. Then I have another bot which I introduced for the very first time in my video, as I showed you. And there I had a starting price of 2,885 US dollars, as you can see down here. The brilliant thing here is that it already has 10% guaranteed grid profit, which means I have 0.104 more Ethereum on the side than if I had just let it sit there. It doesn't sound like much now, but I want to run this conservatively without the risk of liquidation. Of course, you can never say never. Who knows what will happen in the world? Who knows what will happen with Ethereum? And there could be very low prices. But the good thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that if I get close to a liquidation, I have the opportunity to buy another Ethereum at a very low price, which I can then add to the trading pot or even more. Nothing else happens except that I use it as extra margin. I'll get to that when I set it up. And for me, that's basically a spot purchase, which I can take out of the bot again when prices rise, and then I can work with this Ethereum or sell it. The crazy thing here with this bot is that the entry was at 2,885 US dollars, and my current break-even price is at 2,329 US dollars. That means over 500 US dollars below my actual starting price, because I've generated grid profits here. So here you can now see the current results of the first bots that I started. But how do I go about finding good entry points for these trading bots? For that, I personally use, especially for trading bots, and we'll take a look at this with Bitcoin now, because I will also be starting Bitcoin trading bots, the liquidation heat map. In this case, using Coinglass on Model 3. That's where I have the most insight and the best overview when it comes to the liquidation heat map. And here we see several clusters that are below us, and these are all price ranges. Here, for example, 65,000, and here, for example, 56,000 US dollars show me that there are incredibly large amounts of liquidations from long positions, which I would like to take advantage of when we reach these price zones. Of course, I also do a chart analysis. I've already marked the liquidation zones here. Let's take a look at that. Personally, I'm also a chart analyst, and for example, I ask myself, if I had my bear market bottom here, and here is our all-time high, where are the possible price targets based on Fibonacci levels? I also have a complete tutorial on this in the Learn Trading playlist, step by step to becoming a professional trader. But in this case, the 57,000 level is particularly interesting. In the worst case, I know that the 39,000 level at the 0.786 Fibonacci would also be interesting. Because if something worse were to happen in the world, then that would still be a possible scenario where I would definitely want to protect myself. Why do I include this? I want to know, where would I set my grid range? If I now say here, okay, we start one at 56,000 US dollars, then I know, okay, I could leave it open up to, for example, 126,000 US dollars, because then we'd reach the all-time high and there could be a rejection there. And to the downside, at the very least, I want to have some protection, at least some kind of safety net below my grid range that I have set there. That means if I start this here now, I would place my grid range down to around 35,000 US dollars, and above that, I would spread it very widely upwards. But of course, I also have to make sure that my liquidation price moves to a point where I can say I can't be liquidated, or at least where I can say I am as unlikely as possible to be liquidated. Never say never, but in this case, of course, I want to play it safe. And if I include this here now, that would be, for example, my first liquidation price that I want to set, 32,000 US dollars. I must not forget, we are generating grids, the liquidation price drops a bit, and if I get close to the liquidation price, I do nothing except add more bitcoins to lower my liquidation price. And then, when the price rises again, even if it goes out of the range, it can start working again. But these are my worst case scenarios that I include here to really create a conservative bot. Let's take this as an example with Bitcoin. What does it look like when I set this up with Bitcoin, when I set this up on Pionex? In this case, I go to Futures, Futures Bot, and then I have the Coin Margin Futures grid here. And there we already have the option to create it, a long position. Now I say, I want my grid trading range to be at least up to 35,000 US dollars. I enter that here as the lower range. And for the upper range, let's just set it to 125,000 US dollars. Then it has enough room to work. For the next part, I let it suggest how many grids it should put in here. Personally, in this case, I don't want to use arithmetic because then I have different spacing. That means in the middle I have a larger grid spacing, and at the end of this price range, the grid spacing would become smaller. But I would prefer to always have the same spacing, so I click on geometric. And then you see here it now says 0.28% profit per grid. That's already after deducting the fees, but for me personally, that's too little. If I now say I'll do 300, then I'm at about 40 grids. For 0.4%, it could even be a little less. The next thing I do in advance is turn off the auto in reserve. Because as a small example, if I put in 1 Bitcoin now, it would only use 0.28 Bitcoins and put the rest in as reserve. No, I want to manage that myself. That's why I take that out again. I already know in advance that 3 times leverage would be way too high for this price range because it's so large. I'll show this with 2 times leverage and then, as a super conservative example, with 1 times leverage for Bitcoin. I know my starting price because I can set that up in advance. I say I want it to start at 56,000 US dollars. Now I've said that, which would be a bit below. And in this case, the liquidation threshold would also be 56,500. That means we would enter 56,500 US dollars here, and then it would only start from that price. Just as I've drawn it here, the price drops to this point, then the vehicle starts fully automatically and begins trading with this bot. And now I can take a look with 2 times leverage where my liquidation price would be, which I have listed here. If I now say, for example, I put in 1 Bitcoin. I know not everyone out there has 1 Bitcoin, but if we take a look here, you can see my minimum investment. In this case, I can already enter with 0.006 Bitcoin. And if I now say I only use the minimum investment and put that in here once, then it would tell me I have a liquidation price of 33,000. Sorry, since I don't have any Bitcoins here, I have to enter it again and again so that it shows up. That means 33,540 US dollars would be my liquidation price. This means it is below the grid trading range, which is already quite interesting. That would now be the first reasonable setup for me. No matter how much I put in now, even if I say 0.1, to make it a bit simpler, it's 33,409. That's a great liquidation price if we actually get there. Of course, it drops if more grid profits come in. The second point is something I don't have to do right away, but I can do, so I can see, okay, now I say I'll put 0.1 Bitcoin in here. The liquidation price is at 33,409. But what happens if I get close to this liquidation price? I can already buy Bitcoins in advance at a much cheaper price than it is now. And then I can say, okay, I'll manually add another 0.1 Bitcoin here as extra margin. And above is my regular investment of 0.1 Bitcoin. This means in the worst case, if I say, okay, we drop down here and I buy a Bitcoin at 36,392 US dollars, then that would be roughly 3,700 US dollars where I buy it, which I then add here. And my liquidation price drops to 24,788 US dollars. That means my liquidation price immediately drops to about here, which is already incredibly good. And even if this is reached, even if it then shouldn't generate any more grids, but as you can see, I'm currently going through the worst case scenario. If we really should fall incredibly low, then I can say here again, okay, I won't buy 0.1 Bitcoin for 3,700 US dollars anymore. But for example, I can buy another 0.1 Bitcoin for 2,700 US dollars or 2,900 US dollars. And then I have additional margin. And then we'll take a look at where the liquidation price goes after that. Then it would be at 19,703 US dollars. In that case, that would be roughly here. Then we would actually be almost at the last bear market bottom. That's what I mean by worst case scenario. And this extra margin that I would buy here and can add, I'll show you that with a running bot. Because I can go in here and now say, okay, I'll add 2 Ethereum here, and my liquidation price would then drop to 633 US dollars. If the bot is back in profit, I can also remove this at any time and say, okay, I want to take out 1 Ethereum, 2 Ethereum, 5 Ethereum, whatever is in there as extra margin, and have it available to me again. And I can proceed in exactly the same way. But of course, I wouldn't do this at such a price. I'm interested in lower prices. 66,000, 65,000 is still very interesting, but also 56,000. But if I now say, okay, I don't want to have so much stress and maybe get liquidated, I can also do all of this with a 1 times leverage. Since it's coin margined and in this case increases the Bitcoins, it's of course super interesting, even if I do all of this with just 1 times leverage. And if I say here, I'll put in 0.1 Ethereum, then you see my standard liquidation price from the start is only at 24,788 US dollars. And in my opinion, without this being investment advice, that's actually pretty stress-free for me if I do it with 1 times leverage. Do I intend to sell Bitcoins down here? No. Can I use my Bitcoins even if overall they might be at a loss because they're in the bot? Can I use them to increase them? Yes, I can actually do that very well, because if it then takes this entire trend P&L into account and can take it up to 126%, you can see it up here, 126% upwards. But not only during uptrends, of course, grid profits are generated again and again, just as we've seen here, and as a result, the guaranteed profits are continuously set aside, just like we have here. But also the trend P&L. And that's the double advantage. This CoinM grid trading bot generates not only Ethereum in this case due to the grid profits, but also because of the trend P&L. I receive double the Ethereum because I keep closing small trades in between and set those aside. But if we experience a massive surge, and let's move on to Ethereum here, because there are also incredibly interesting levels to look at on the liquidation map. And if Ethereum has a surge like this, for example, a massive increase, consolidates for a long time, can collect an incredible amount of grid profits here, and then actually rises parabolically with a small correction, then continues to rise parabolically, then it takes all of that as trend P&L along with small grid profits in between. And that is, of course, really, really brilliant. Now, let's just go over this very briefly. I also don't want to make the video much longer on Ethereum, and then there will be a small warning about altcoins. I'd be very, very cautious there. In fact, I would actually wait until we reach a bottom, a bear market bottom, before I would invest in those. But if we look at all of this with Ethereum here, I'll make it a bit less glaring. We see 2,000 US dollars, a very interesting level because there are again large liquidations here for an Ethereum bot, 2,000 US dollars. Where do I have this bot? That was exactly the bot I started here. Why? Because in the past there was a very large liquidation cluster on the liquidation heat map. And that was the reason why I opened it there as well. Even though we dropped in between and have now risen again, it was a very good level. There are further levels. 1900, 1877, 1833. And for me, a very interesting level at 1658 US dollars. I will definitely put more Ethereum into that, roughly into 5 to 10 Ethereum trading bots. But now a really important risk warning. Let's take the example of Solana or XRP. Solana, as we can see, when Solana drops, Solana was already at $259 and then it went down to 20 US dollars. I would be cautious about opening that too early. If we look at all of this on the chart, where Solana could go, because we don't have much volume left here and at this point in time, let me quickly bring in another chart. We can see that this is our last volume block. And if we drop below it, things could move very quickly for Solana, and we could reach $58 and then maybe down to 47, depending on what happens in the crypto market. As a small example, I see something similar with XRP. If XRP drops, it can fall really hard. And what do I mean by this? We're actually at the last volume block that we're forming right now. If Bitcoin falls, if Solana falls, if the crypto market falls, things could move very quickly for Ethereum in this direction and we could be back below $1. And you first have to compensate for that with grid trading bots. That's why I'm keeping my feet still here and actually waiting, if I even do it at all, until there's a real moment of panic when we have one last big crash and everything is in the basement, when people start thinking again, okay, crypto is dead. That's when I would start using exactly those altcoins that I still have on the side to open grid trading bots in CoinMargin. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a bit longer than planned, but of course I wanted to explain everything in detail. I would really appreciate it if you left a subscription and a like. Also, check out my other strategy for 100% passive income on autopilot. There will be a separate video coming soon where I'll also show how I'm preparing for the bull market, a bit different from the strategy I'm showing here, because this one gives me ongoing passive income with the DCA bots. But now I want to use something here so that in case I don't find the perfect bot for myself, it will already buy automatically for me and I'll get a very good average purchase price as a result. Until next time, bye.